This is the Lou Rockwell Show.
Well, how great to have as our guest this morning my old friend Dr. Chris Manion. Chris received his Ph.D. from Notre Dame under the great Gerhard Niemeyer. Today he's a columnist for The Wanderer. He's a businessman. He's president of Manion Music, LLC, in the Shenandoah Valley. Chris worked for Jesse Helms during the entire Reagan years. And Chris, before we get into the topic of our conversation today, which is the neoconservatives, the people, the ideas that animate them, and what sort of a force they represent in our country and in the world, I mentioned a great man, Gerhard Niemeyer, but I want to talk about another very great man, your dad, Dean Clarence Manion. I had the honor to meet him once. Tell us a little bit about his role, why he didn't become Attorney General in the Eisenhower administration, his role in the Goldwater for President campaign, and just in so many areas, he was just such an important intellectual, but also just a very great man as a person. Tell us about Dean Clarence Manion a little bit.
Well, he was a great man, Lou. He went to school in Washington during before the First World War, and was head of Catholics for Wilson when Wilson promised no more war. He's not going to get into war. He was an advisor to General Wood at the beginning of the Second World War, when 70% of Americans wanted to stay out of that war. And he was dean of the Notre Dame Law School at that time, where he taught law for 30 years. When it came to the Eisenhower administration, something my dad had told his students since 1919 came back in a big way. He told them, if you take the first bribe, you may as well take the rest. Well, Eisenhower wanted to bribe him from supporting the Bricker Amendment, which would have limited Eisenhower's power to make another Yalta or Tehran or Potsdam agreement, many of which we've seen since then, by the way. Dad said, no, I want to fight this, even though John Foster Dulles was very strongly against Dad. And Ike said, look, I'll put you on the Supreme Court if you'll just be neutral. Well, thank goodness Dad didn't buy into that, and he came back home to Indiana instead of moving to Bethesda. Then he started the Manion Forum, and I remember meeting you at our front door when you came to Indiana to record that program. For 25 years, he was on the air weekly with a conservative radio program, the first one of its kind, that featured people from across the spectrum of what today we might call loosely the conservative spectrum. He died in 1979, and in my old age, I am rereading his early works and identifying with his love of the Constitution and his immense respect for the relationship of God and government with every passing day.
Well, Chris, you mentioned the Bricker Amendment, Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles and the whole administration, of course, being very much against it, because it would have hampered presidential power. And if we think of the group, the ideological group that advocates what I would talk about as an elected presidential dictatorship today, the idea that the president can make wars on his own, he can, of course, make all kinds of quasi-treaty agreements, secret executive agreements on his own, that he's the man at the top of the pyramid in an entirely unconstitutional way. One of the groups that advocates that the most these days is the neoconservatives. And you ran into the neoconservatives when you worked for Jesse Helms, and you've certainly been interested in them, written about them, talked about them ever since. What an important and influential group this is. So tell us a little bit, first of all, about their ideological orientation and its origins.
Well, a neoconservative in a thumbnail way is a left-winger who changes his uniform but not his mind as he moves to identify with whatever political party or movement might be most powerful at the moment. The reason he doesn't change his mind is because he comes from a very simply leftist background, and the fundamental opposition of that to the Constitution is simple. The Constitution and the Christian history of 2,000 years of the West believe in limits on government. And in Federalist 1, Hamilton says that this might be the time when those limits on government might be decided for all time, because the United States, the new country, had this wonderful opportunity to prove that government could be of the people by choice and rational thinking and not by accident and force. Well, the neocons believe in force. The neocons, stemming from an ideological background that goes back to Lenin and from a theoretical background that goes back to Leo Strauss, a political philosopher whom I much admire, believe that the question is not what is good for man. That was Aristotle's question. That was the founder's question. But who shall rule? They aim for power, and that power can't be limited either by a constitution or by geography, which accounts for their desire to spread democracy around the world, no matter what the elected tyrant does with the power that democracy permits him to exercise. They have no principles, but they do have a very strong and, may I say, focused, burning laser beam desire for power.
And, of course, when we talk about spreading democracy around the world, what they actually mean is their control. Because, of course, the wrong people get elected. It's not a democracy.
Yes, one man, one vote once. And they are so adept at the ways of Washington that when they see the Tea Party coming with this notion of limits on spending, limits on power, limits on intrusion, limits on the ability of government to constantly harass our lives, they chuckle and say, well, these guys don't know anything about Washington. They just hate it. But they're not going to, the Tea Party is not going to take over Washington without even knowing where the bodies are buried. They pride themselves, and they're a small group, and several of the people that I would call their elite membership have talked to me about how they pride themselves in their knowledge. They pride themselves in their ability to manipulate. They were surprised, frankly, when they had so much power in the Bush administration, but they were glad to use it, and they did.
And they, of course, promoted the war against Iraq right from the very beginning.
Yes, and now we have General Shelton, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at that time, saying that they pushed that war, that unnecessary war, to the point of insubordination of the president himself. That's what they consider the Constitution. It's in the ash can. Their point is to spread their power, and they are for power and unlimited government as long as they are in charge. Once they're out of power, they will join the people on the right, the old right, complaining that government is too large, until they are back in power. Then that evaporates, and they are strictly focused on control, on broader war, and let's face it, a lot of their funding comes from the war industry and corruption. Chalabi, for instance, who stole tens of millions and was their favorite in Iraq. These relationships are not narrowly limited to the neocons. One staffer across the hall from me in the Senate, John Kenneth Galbraith's son, Peter Galbraith, was a government servant all his life, civil servant, Senate staffer, a Clinton ambassador. He's just made $30 million on an oil deal with the Norwegians in Basra, northern Iraq, one of the Kirkuk. Well, that's what insiders do. He learned from the neocons how to do this. So they have an impact beyond their own narrow membership, because, frankly, there's a lot of filthy lucre involved in endless war.
Chris, give us some names. We think of course, the original sort of the after Leo Strauss, as you say, the intellectual inspiration. But in our own country, and in our time, Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz were certainly two of the top people. Kristol is now dead. Podhoretz, I guess, pretty much retired. Who are the key people?
Podhoretz's son-in-law, Elliott Abrams, was a central figure in the Reagan administration's foreign policy. He had to plead guilty to lying in the Iran-Contra issue, but he surfaced again in the White House under George W. Bush running Middle Eastern policy. Now, there's a real powerful insider figure, scarred to be sure. He could never be confirmed by the Senate again because of his conviction. But nonetheless, the 20-year experience of being inside and knowing all the leverages of power certainly put him above the likes of Karen Hughes or Condi Rice, who were flaky, frankly, and third-rate intellectuals. Another one, of course, from the outside, I'd have to say, is Rupert Murdoch, who is a very powerful source of communication and influence in the movement through his newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and his television networks, the very successful Fox News network. One that comes to mind, Lou, is General Petraeus. General Petraeus, whom we assume to just be a PhD general who's trying to go out and have a career and to make progress in Afghanistan after Iraq, he is a trainee of a fellow named Max Boot. And whenever he gets into trouble, his emails have been published. He writes Max Boot to find out how to get out of trouble. And one of them, now, when I taught at Boston University, Elie Wiesel's office was right next to me. Well, Petraeus says, here, I've made this statement about Israel's influence, and everybody's mad. Should I tell them that I had Elie Wiesel and his wife over to dinner last Saturday night? I mean, this is the way these people think. It's very adolescent, but it's in high school, you want to be popular. When you grow up, you want to have power. Now, we Americans have a tradition of limited government and limited power. The founders understood this succinctly. Christendom has a unique history of limited power because of Augustine's insight that if the state can't save your soul, then it can't do the most important thing for you, and its powers are limited. No other region in the world in history had that insight, nor did it impose those limits. The neocons ignore all that. The limits evaporate when they have power. They advocate limits only when it's on their competition.
And don't they actually advocate lying? I mean, if we think of and of course he was a brilliant political philosopher, Leo Strauss, didn't he advocate lying, especially the noble lie, as a legitimate thing for the philosophers who should be guiding the government?
Yes, Leo Strauss had an interesting essay on that topic, how the philosopher has to protect himself in a society that has religion and tradition at heart, which is anti-philosophical. Eric Vogelin told me 40 years ago that Strauss had lost whatever faith he had in God, and thus he turned to philosophy as the highest calling of man, but a calling that was constantly harassed by the hoi polloi, even the political realm. So the philosopher had to put out a certain amount of disinformation in order not to rile the masses against them, and one would have to call that lying, but lying in the service of philosophy. Let me say that Socrates never would buy that. I disagree with Strauss on him putting those words in the mouth of Socrates, but nonetheless, you have to observe that, as my father told the students, if you tell the first lie, you may as well tell the rest. And that's why it's so important for groups like LRC's writers, who come from a large pantheon, a very wide spectrum. Somebody has to just tell the truth and live with the consequences. Right now, one cannot be successful in either political party without lying, or certainly without winking at a lot of lies that other people are telling, because their support would evaporate. But somebody, I have in mind Joe Sobran, my predecessor at The Wanderer, who just passed away last month, a wonderful artist with words, but even more profoundly an artist with with telling the truth in the simplest way, things that everyone is aware of. The emperor has no clothes, but only the child will point out, because all of the adults are living part of the lie. And in Strauss's view, which I think is embraced consciously or otherwise, in Strauss's view, we philosophers have to hide an awful lot of what we think and know in order to attain power and influence and encourage those in power to pursue the ends that we embrace, but never disclose.
So here we have this ideological tendency that was quite powerful in the Reagan administration, massively powerful in the Bush administration. Perhaps was Dick Cheney the chief neocon in the Bush administration?
Well, I think he intentionally surrounded himself with people of that persuasion. I think that he had a very high regard for his own intellect vis-a-vis that of George Bush, for whom I think he had nothing but condescension. His wife, was captured early on during the Reagan administration by the neocons and given all sorts of lavish publishing opportunities, and eventually wound up in a fairly high position in the Reagan administration, something like the National Endowment for Humanities, one of those out, in order constantly to cultivate and inculcate ideas. I don't think Cheney grew up a neoconservative. I just think he grew up an ambitious politician. And by the way, I have friends who worked with him in the Midwest in the late 1950s, early 1960s, in campaigns, or at least the mid-1960s. For 40 years, this man never got home before 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And he was working all day long in various political appointments and capacities. And I think that there's a lot it's very telling in his, remember the man he shot down in Texas? Cheney never apologized. Remember when the collapse of the financial world in the fall of 2008 was coming to pass, and President Bush had no serious business experience, whereas Cheney had been a CEO and knew all the financial people. What was his single goal? To get a pardon for Scooter Libby, who had been convicted of a felony. I mean, these people, they have 40 years of doing nothing but pursuing power, and sooner or later you become detached from a fundamental understanding of reality.
Well, it's the old, power is not only corrupting, it's actually makes these people in some sense crazy. It seems to me they come to have a view of them. Certainly they're able to exercise various functions that no human being should be exercising. The ability to just, bomb a city and kill people at random in the name of national defense or fighting terrorism or whatever is the excuse of the moment, and has a bad effect on them. And they actually, maybe it's Tolkien's point about they're wearing the ring, and it definitely alters them in the exercise of this power.
Do you remember in the 1980s when people were talking about the decade of greed? I've never heard a politician condemn the desire for power. In the Gospel, in actually the Epistle of St. John, the Superbia Vitae, and in Augustine, Libido Dominandi, these are the greatest temptations, the lust for power, glory, and fame, much more than for money. Eventually you get enough money. Cheney's got enough money. But when you are up against these people, Lou, as a freedom fighter like you have to recognize that the gospel also, Christ also observes, I'm reading from St. Luke here, the gospel, for the children of this world are, in their generation, wiser than the children of light. When you have power-hungry people working 24/7 for more power, and we go to them and we are reading, we have families, we have lives, we are comfortable, we want to be left alone for pursuits other than politics, that gives them an edge. That gives them the arrogance that they have in Washington that Trent Lott expressed by saying, as soon as these Tea Party types get to Washington, we're going to co-opt them. The Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol's magazine, which is, again, another representation of the neocon power and influence, the Weekly Standard is now advocating on its cover how we will take, we Tea Party types. I mean, it's almost laughable that they want to wrap themselves in the cloak of everything they despise. The hoi polloi, the unwashed, pro-lifers, the pro-family types. They have nothing but contempt for this, but yet they see it, Lou. Hey, the field is wide open. And this is what happened to them in 2001 and 2002. They found themselves getting power that they never dreamed of having. And they have said as much. They have said, one of their very small number, whom I will not name, has told me, we didn't expect this opportunity, but we're darn well going to use it.
There were some very interesting interviews conducted with Khrushchev after his forced retirement by Roy Medvedev. The one thing that strikes me from having read that book was where Khrushchev is saying, at a certain point in your life, fast cars, dachas, sumptuous food, beautiful clothes, girlfriends, that all pales, he said. Money, he said, consumer goods, none of it matters. But he said, you never tire of power. They always want to exercise power, and they love, unlike normal human beings, they love, for example, killing people. I've often thought that not only do they want to go to war for reasons of making a lot of money out of it and for becoming even more important people and pounding their chests about how great they are, but I think they actually like killing people. They actually are a very bad bunch.
Well, the leftist has always, I love that line from Darkness at Noon, where Rubishov explains that to the party, the individual is 1/1,000,000th of a million men. He's just a cipher, and an insignificant one at that. But if you look at the party background, you see that the elite, they fight desperately against one another in the various communist and leftist organizations to lead, because the ideology confers upon them as the leadership the intellectual seal of approval, which allows them to do anything they want. There's no morality except the maintenance of power. That's Lenin. And the neocons might try to shed that, but it's very hard to get the country out of the boy when he comes to the big city. It's very hard to get the leftist out of the neocon. I mean, have you ever heard any neocon apologize for the profound disasters caused by their influence in the Bush administration? My old friend John Bolton? No, he wants to run for president. He did such a fine job. I mean, this is, as C.S. Lewis would put it, bent. This is not straight. This is bent thinking. And it's bent by the gravity of power, which has a gravity stronger than the planet Jupiter.
I won't name names of individuals, but I was once involved in something at the Heritage Foundation, which is an important conservative think tank with, how shall I say, the neoconservatives are very powerful there, probably second only to their role at the American Enterprise Institute. And they would not allow a writer for their magazine to criticize the Russian Revolution. Because, of course, you're supposed to believe in the Russian. You can be anti-communist in some sense. You can be anti-Stalin. But you couldn't, of course, they don't actually want you to be anti-Lenin. And you have to believe it's a great thing the Tsar was overthrown and that all those people were murdered. Chris, I knew Karl Rove a little bit many years ago in Texas politics. And I want to tell you, he's always been an advocate of bigger government with the express purpose that the Republicans should be in charge of the contracts. The Republicans, as versus the Democrats, should be getting the dough and the power. And, for these people, it's like the blue and the greens and Byzantium. It's just a matter of whose horse team is going to win the race. There really are no deeper principles involved, except, of course, again, money and power for your side.
When I was overseeing programs that would give out a few tens of millions each, which was penny ante, for the Senate in the 80s, who was coming knocking on our door but the conservatives? Can you get me a piece of this pie? Can you get me a piece of this pie? Well, the Democrats very pleasantly added a little emolument on top of what they called the grandfathered organizations that were getting grants. They put 10% more in for the conservatives, but they never let their core grandfathered institutions be cut one penny. And that was the story of the so-called triumph of conservatism in the 1980s. Most conservative organizations were bought off.
Well, Chris Manion, you've never been bought off, and I appreciate your voice on LouRockwell.com, in The Wanderer, everything else you do. And I want to thank you so much for coming on with us this morning and helping us understand a little bit more about this very important ideological tendency that came out of the left and now seems to be, in large part, running the conservative movement in the Republican Party, the neoconservatives. So, Chris, thanks so much.
Well, Lou, I want to congratulate you on a very effective, penetrating voice that you've provided. Every time I write for LRC, my inbox is overflowing from all over the world. And that kind of outreach to freedom-loving people who are hungry, not for power, but for knowledge and for understanding, is so edifying. I feel like every time I write an article for LRC, I'm in a large classroom and I get to teach. So it's a great honor. Thank you so much for having me on, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, Lou. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Lou Rockwell Show, produced by LouRockwell.com, the best-read libertarian website in the world. If you'd like to advertise on this podcast or on the website, email advertising@LouRockwell.com. And thanks for listening.